Good evening, everyone. We're going to be starting in just a few minutes. Welcome to our Equity and Inclusion Speaker Series. We're just going to be waiting a few minutes as folks enter from the waiting room, and we're really looking forward to our talk. Hello, colleagues. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to our BUSSW Equity and Inclusion Speaker Series event, Queering the Climate Crisis, LGBTQ plus Livelihoods, Public Health and Disasters with Brandon Rothrock, PhD student. My name is Leila Khair. I'm a full-time lecturer at Boston University School of Social Work, and I'm currently the co-interim Associate Dean of Equity and Inclusion. Our Equity and Inclusion Committee includes all BUSSW stakeholders, faculty, staff, students, administrators, and alumni. The committee has been around for many years, engaging in the work of building equity, justice, and anti-oppressive practice here at BUSSW, as well as amplifying social justice-focused activities in the community. Some of the work we've engaged in includes organizing social justice and anti-oppressive learning communities, creating anti-oppressive teaching and learning labs, student support and solidarity circles, and mentoring for anti-oppressive practice. We also have a wonderful resource page available to anyone that includes podcasts, peer-reviewed literature, and media articles that I encourage everyone to check out at our Equity and Inclusion resource page. Finally, we have a free 3-hour online module on structural and institutional racism, again available to anyone in the world that you can access online as well. You can now also receive 3 CEUs for completing this module. I'm going to briefly review our format today. I'll introduce Brandon, and he'll present for about 30 minutes. We'll then have 3 members of our BUSSW community offer a 1-minute reflection about the talk and ask Brandon a question. Finally, we'll be able to answer a few questions from our audience that you can type directly into the chat. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few Zoom housekeeping items. Anyone who's receiving CEUs is strongly encouraged to keep their camera on during the entire session. If you are receiving CEUs, you'll need to complete the evaluation form. At the end of the talk, we'll type the link to the evaluation form into the chat at the end of the presentation. We cannot send you the evaluation form after the presentation is over. You must access it from the chat during this presentation. The link to the form, again, will be posted in the chat at the end of the entire presentation. Once you complete the evaluation form, it'll take up to 2 weeks for you to receive your CEU certificate. We suggest having your Zoom setting on speaker's view. We will be recording the presentation, so if you aren't comfortable being recorded and you aren't receiving CEUs, please keep your camera off during the speaker's presentation. We will be posting the recording on our Equity and Inclusion Speaker Series page a few days after the talk. All participants will be muted during the presentation. Please do not use the chat during the presentation, as that can be distracting for the speaker. Closed captioning is available for this event. You can access closed captioning through Zoom. If joining by computer, click on the live transcript button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Once you click on live transcript, please then click enable to start the closed captioning. If joining by phone, go to settings and then meeting and then closed captioning. Finally, it goes without saying that all comments in the chat should be respectful and mindful of our entire BUSSW community. We'd like to begin our presentation with a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement is merely a reminder and only the first step in acknowledging and addressing colonization as an enduring reality, and that Boston University sits on the stolen traditional lands of the Massachusetts people. If you're outside of Boston, take some time to learn about the tribal lands where you live and the ongoing movements to have land honored, acknowledged, and returned. Now I'm excited to present our speaker for tonight's talk. In the wake of 2 disastrous hurricanes, devastating long-term effects of racial capitalism, ongoing consequences of classism, gender oppression, and climate injustice, we're so looking forward to Brandon's talk as social workers continue to consider their roles in these challenging times. In this talk, geographer Brandon Rothrock discusses the intersection of LGBTQIA+ livelihoods and public health in the context of climate change. Rothrock explores how disasters such as hurricanes, floods, and other extreme weather events directly exacerbate existing social and environmental inequities for the LGBTQIA+ community and challenges dominant narratives and disaster preparedness and response. Brandon Rothrock, pronouns are he, him, is a second-year geography PhD student at The Ohio State University, where he focuses on LGBTQIA+ livelihoods and energy transition in Appalachia. Outside of Ohio State, Brandon is an agent of change and environmental justice fellow through Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health and Environmental Health News, and is a board member of OUT for Sustainability, OUT4S, a queer-led nonprofit that focuses on climate resilience and environmental justice by and for the LGBTQIA+ community. And I will be sharing my screen, and I will be handing it over to Brandon.
Great. Thank you, Layla. I just wanted to first start off by saying thank you so much to the Boston University School of Social Work and also the Equity and Inclusion Speaker Series Committee for hosting me tonight. And today I'll be talking about queering the climate crisis, looking at the intersection between LGBTQ plus livelihoods, public health, and disasters. Next slide, please. So I have a pretty jam-packed agenda today, but there are basically three main areas to my presentation. The first one being climate change and context. So here I will be discussing the differences between weather and climate, looking a little into the definition of human-induced climate change, also intersections between public health and climate change, and then focusing a majority of the talk afterwards on extreme weather events, which can be hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, things like that. And then my next piece will be talking about LGBTQ plus social marginalization in the US, particularly looking at how we define LGBTQ plus and queerness, some pressing LGBTQ issues that we see today in American society, and then also the geographical unevenness of this marginalization as well. Third, we'll be talking about climate change impacts, so combining them together with LGBTQ social marginalization. So we'll be looking at two recent studies that have come out around LGBTQ plus risk. We'll also be discussing a little bit about my master's work that looked at climate change and queer mental health. And then we'll conclude by looking at sort of drivers of discrimination and bias during disasters. And then finally, we'll connect back to social work. So thinking about social work and the intersection between the environment. And then also I'll provide some recommendations around equitable and inclusive policy. Next slide, please. So first, thinking about climate change in context, thinking about weather and climate and the differences between them. And so essentially, we hear these terms pretty often in our everyday lives, and the difference between them mostly has to deal with time. So weather is short term, meaning it's on a time scale of hours or days or weeks. And these are changes or events in atmospheric conditions, whether it's precipitation, temperature, wind. And again, these occur on very, very short time spans. So thinking about if there was sort of a rain shower today or it was really cold the past couple days, that's what we would assume to be as weather. And then thinking about climate, again, that's more long-term average weather conditions in a specific place, usually over 30 years or more. So thinking about Boston, for example, the average temperature in December is about 43 degrees. And so thinking about these two terms, we then think about climate change, which is long-term shifts in temperature, precipitation, and overall weather patterns. And so climate change can be natural, whether it's volcanic eruptions or changes in the sun's activity, which can alter the global temperature, or they can be human-induced, which I will discuss a bit more on the next slide. So thinking about the term human-induced climate change. So here I'm really thinking about how human activities, mainly the burning of fossil fuels, are the main driver of the climate change that we see today. And so there are also some other human activities, whether it's transportation, agriculture, deforestation, but essentially the burning of fossil fuels is the main driver of climate change that we are seeing currently. And so globally, the burning of fossil fuels, whether it's coal, oil, natural gas, these fuels emit greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane, which directly alter the greenhouse effect and they increase Earth's global warming temperatures or surface temperatures. And so with this global surface temperature warming, there are a lot of environmental and ecological impacts or exposure pathways for humans that come about this climate change. And so as we've been seeing, climate change increases both average and extreme temperatures in the US. Through that, we're seeing that a lot of average temperatures around the US have gone up, and there has been less sort of cooler conditions around winter and things like that. Climate change also influences the levels and location of outdoor air pollutants. So with climate change, there are particulate matter, ozone, other things that are in the atmosphere that are considered air pollutants that have sort of moved across spaces due to climate change. And then also on top of that, climate change alters the seasonality, distribution, and prevalence of vector, food, and waterborne diseases. So as an example, thinking about ticks in North America, essentially they have a longer season that they are, out in the environment, and also their geography or location that they have been in historically is sort of shifting north as well due to the increase in temperatures in North America, particularly in the Northeast. Next slide, please. So next, I'll just briefly discuss the intersections between climate change and human health. And so as I just mentioned, there are a few climate drivers such as increased temperatures, precipitation extremes, extreme weather events, and sea level rise. And all of these climate drivers are in particular environmental and institutional contexts and also social and behavioral contexts. So for environmental and institutional context, thinking about geography, agricultural production, infrastructure condition, and on the other side, thinking about social and behavioral contexts with age and gender, race and ethnicity, poverty, education. Sort of all of these factors with climate drivers influence our exposure pathways to climate change issues. So thinking about extreme heat, poor air quality, reduced food and water quality, and population displacement, and how all of these sort of create negative health outcomes for humans. So thinking about heat-related illnesses, food and water, and vector-borne diseases, and then also mental health consequences and stress, which I'll be discussing a bit more in depth as we move through the presentation. So as Leila mentioned, we are coming sort of off the back of two major hurricanes that have hit Florida recently and has caused damage geographically across the southeastern US. So next I'll be speaking a bit more about extreme weather events. And so climate change increases the occurrence and severity of extreme weather events, whether it's hurricanes, tornadoes, heat waves, droughts, and floods. Climate change also increases human exposure to extreme events. So we've seen with Milton and Helene, death, injuries, illness, and also just the overall exacerbation of underlying medical conditions. We've also seen with these two hurricanes that climate change has increased the disruption of infrastructure, whether it's power, water, transportation, or communication systems. As we've seen recently in Western North Carolina, there are still many communities that do not have power, running water, food. And so thinking about that in the context of climate change is super important there as well. And also just thinking about climate change, thinking about hurricanes themselves, it increases our vulnerability to coastal flooding. And so due to increases in the frequency and intensity of extreme precipitation, rainfall rates, hurricanes, combined with sea level rise, a majority of people in the US live along the coasts. And so we're going to be seeing some bigger issues moving forward in the future around climate change and extreme weather. Next slide, please. And also, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about sort of the intersection between extreme weather events and also disaster preparedness and response. So thinking about how disaster preparedness and response is really entangled in a web of political, socioeconomic, and environmental happenings. So thinking about Hurricane Helene, like we just mentioned, recently there have been threats against FEMA workers in Western North Carolina, which has really sort of hampered hurricane aid. There's a lot of misinformation or disinformation that is coming out of many sort of political groups or political candidates. And recently, FEMA has had to create a webpage as a part of their sort of bigger webpage about their work with a sort of FAQ or rumor fact sheet. So bringing up certain rumors like, as you see on the screen, FEMA is preventing residents and companies from removing debris in hurricane-affected areas. They're sort of having to put out these statements and also say that, hey, these things are false that you might be seeing in the media or on social media like Facebook. And so these sort of political, socio-economic happenings are really influencing how disaster preparedness and response occurs geographically. Next slide, please. So next, thinking about LGBTQ plus social marginalization in the US, LGBTQ individuals, often due to their gender identity, sexual orientation, and/or gender expression, are socially marginalized. And I also wanted to bring the definition of queer in here as well. So queer challenges the binary neatness of gender identity and same-sex and opposite-sex attraction to signify the multiplicity and fluidity of sexual desires and relations. And so usually you might hear LGBTQ plus community, queer community, sort of these terms are mostly used sort of in tandem with one another or in place of one another. And queerness is really just sort of signifying breaking down sort of this categorization that a lot of LGBTQ plus people situate themselves in and their identities. And thinking about their identity as well, sort of in relation to gender expression, gender identity, sexual orientation, but also race, ability, and socioeconomic status as well. And so I have a little picture here on the screen just thinking about intersectionality, how sexual orientation and gender specifically intersect our other pieces of our identities. Next, I'll just discuss an overview of some of the pressing issues that LGBTQ people experience in everyday spaces. The first being discrimination in housing, employment, education, and accessing services. So LGBT people of color are 3 times more likely than white, straight, cisgender people to live below the poverty line. We have seen a really big uptick in anti-trans legislation or the introduction of anti-trans bills around the US. Over 500 have been introduced in 2023 nationwide, and a majority of these target trans students or trans athletes. Recently, there has been a lot of pushback of a trans college athlete who is on the San Jose State University women's volleyball team, and a lot of different teams in the Mountain West Conference have sort of forfeited their games in protest of this trans student participating in sports. And again, really ties into sort of this broader narrative or broader pushback we're seeing against trans people and trans rights in the US. Also, homelessness rates, LGBTQ plus people experience higher rates of homelessness and housing security than straight people, and especially LGBTQ youth as well. And finally, there's a lack of access to healthcare or gender-affirming care. Nearly 1 in 4 transgender people avoid seeking healthcare due to fear of discrimination or mistreatment due to their gender identity. And roughly 15% of LGBTQ plus adults do not have health insurance, which is compared to 12% of non-LGBTQ plus adults in the US. Next slide, please. So thinking about these pressing issues, I wanted to also back up as a geographer, thinking about sort of the geographical unevenness of how LGBTQ people move throughout space throughout the country. So thinking about the sort of rich gay stereotype, thinking about how there are sort of this notion that a lot of queer people are affluent and live in very affluent gay neighborhoods or gayborhoods around the US, particularly in urban areas like Chicago, San Francisco, and New York, when in reality, there are a lot of queer people and LGBTQ plus people that do not live in these spaces and are also subject to heteronormative NIMBYism, or not in my backyard ism, which is essentially that there's been restricted zoning for gay-owned establishments. There's been a historical promotion of FHA loans for married straight couples, which have pushed LGBTQ people into low income or under-resourced areas. And also, just more broadly as well, a lot of gay-owned establishments are consistently and violently attacked. We've seen with the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando that happened a few years ago. And also Bar PM in St. Louis, I believe it was last year, a cop had rammed their patrol car into a nightclub in St. Louis, and then the owner, who was gay, was arrested during that sort of altercation, and it made headlines as well around the US. So thinking about how queer establishments, even though there are very few of them, are constantly being attacked in the US. And then thinking also too about just urbanization or metronormativity. Metronormativity is essentially the thought that queer people move or need to move to sort of urban areas to find community. And with that, LGBTQ people are often concentrated in urban areas, which have high degrees of impervious services, and low-income urban areas have less forest cover and access to green space, which can increase vulnerability to extreme heat, poor air quality, and other disasters as well. So next, I just wanted to briefly go over two studies that have come out recently, sort of tying LGBTQ issues and climate change impacts together. And so the first one is titled Climate Change Risks for LGBT People in the United States. This came out of Mahawald and Shaw, who are both researchers at the Williams Institute at UCLA Law School. Essentially, they looked at NASA and FEMA risk projections by county data, and then also looked at the 2020 census to see where same-sex couples are located in the US. And what they found was that LGBTQ people in same-sex couples are at greater risk of exposure to the negative effects of climate change compared to straight couples, and LGBT people have a greater geographic risk of exposure to weather hazards. And again, they're likely to reside in communities that have poor infrastructure and less access to resources, therefore heightening their vulnerability, and these spaces as well have lowered resilience capabilities, particularly during extreme weather events. And if you see the table that I put on the screen as well, you can see here that there are different counties like the District of Columbia, San Francisco County, New York County, again, major areas where we find a lot of same-sex couples. They also have very high FEMA risk scores and NASA risk scores as well. So here, combining those two things together, showing that LGBT people have a greater risk of exposure to negative effects of climate change. Next slide, please. And so also coming out of this report, looking at these two maps here, figure 1, you can see the percent of coupled households by US county that are same sex. And then also figure 2, which is the NASA climate risk projections by US county. And you can see here some of the major urban areas in the US like Boston, DC, Tampa, New Orleans, Miami, San Francisco, you name it, have a high proportion of same-sex couples. And also these areas are at higher risks of climate change issues as well. Another study I wanted to bring up was called Amplified Harm, which is about LGBTQ plus disaster displacement. And this looks at responses from the Census Household Pulse Survey, which was from 2022 to 2023. Essentially, the Pulse Survey was created, I believe, during the COVID pandemic to essentially grab large samples of data around social and economic issues that people are facing around the US. And so sexual orientation and other issues, particularly focused on the LGBTQ community, were introduced sort of at the tail end of 2023 when the Pulse survey was sent out. And so with this survey, they found that national LGBTQ plus disaster displacement is nearly 2 times higher than cisgender heterosexual displacement, and is higher in most states as well. LGBTQ individuals face worse displacement conditions compared to cisgender heterosexual individuals, and is highest among LGBTQ people of color. They also found that fires and tornadoes lead to nearly double or triple the displacement among LGBTQ populations at the national level. And another finding, which I found to be pretty interesting, was that states with more anti-LGBTQ plus policies also generally have higher LGBTQ plus displacement during disasters. And so here I put some of the maps that Geiger, Goldsmith, and Mendez put in their report, essentially looking at different states and how LGBTQ displacement differs by tornadoes, floods, and hurricanes. And you can see, particularly for hurricanes, Florida Louisiana, there's high displacement for LGBTQ people. For flooding, we're seeing sort of the Midwest or Mountain West, and also for tornadoes, singing the upper Midwest as well. Next slide, please. And so next I'll discuss LGBTQ mental health and climate change. And so thinking about all of the information that I've thrown at you all over the past 20 minutes or so, thinking about how climate change particularly impacts mental health, thinking about how extreme weather events, wildfires, and other disasters contribute to adverse mental health outcomes. Mental health conditions, including anxiety and depression, have become more prevalent in the US over the past decade, especially among adolescents, and that's sort of outside of thinking about climate change as well. And marginalized groups, so thinking about elderly people, women, people with disabilities, people of color, often already have high fear, stress, and anxiety in their day-to-day due to their limited social capital and or political exclusion, and or political inclusion, and they're further excluded and sidelined during disaster events as well. And so thinking particularly about sexual and gender minorities, they face social, economic, and health disparities, and therefore experience a greater risk of harm from climate change. Next, I'd just like to briefly go over some of my master's research, pulling out some interview quotes that I found would be pretty interesting for people to look at. Essentially, during my master's work, I was looking at how LGBTQ undergraduate students in Appalachia were thinking about their sexual identity in relation to the environment and climate change. And what I found was that there was a heightened awareness to social and environmental problems on the basis of the participants being LGBTQ+. And so with this quote really exemplifies seeing how there's sort of a difference in how the queer community perceives things that are going on in the society around us. When you're in a minority group or a member of a minority group, there's a difference. You're more aware of how everything going on in the world is going to affect you and how it's going to affect your friends. Next slide, please. Next, a lot of the participants spoke about their negative emotions associated with climate change. Here, this one student was thinking that they were extremely angry, frustrated, hopeless, pessimistic. Pretty much optimistic is the least likely word that would ever come to my mind when talking about climate change, which is sad because we need to have hope and we need to be optimistic, but it's very hard when I feel I'm aware. I don't want to say that I'm aware of everything and I have the answers and I'm the smartest person. But when I know it's about industrial change and having the government recognize it and hold big industry accountable, that is a part of capitalism, I just know we are never going to get there. And so a lot of students, again, were really thinking about how climate change made them feel. And again, almost all of the participants that I spoke to talked about very negative emotions associated with climate change and just understanding how these climate change issues will affect them as well. Next, another thing that came out of my research that surprised me was that there was a lot of uncertainty around climate change. A lot of the students had understood about climate change in their coursework, having conversations with friends, and also just their broader understanding of climate change through social media. But a lot of students felt that they couldn't necessarily pinpoint how climate change would affect them in the future personally. And so this quote here, I'll read aloud as well. This interviewer said, "I think that with climate change, there's a lot of things that we won't be able to predict. I feel like we can do an all right job making predictions like climate projections, models, and all that stuff. But I feel like there's going to be so many effects that we wouldn't even think of that would affect us. I think I will continually get more stressed and concerned about this as I go on. I think that it would affect me in the future a lot more than it affects me now. Also, because the effects that will be much worse in the future as well than what we experience now, time catches up." So thinking back to what I was talking about before, sort of with weather, climate, and climate change, thinking about how, although we have all these models of climate change, we have all these predictions, we're not sure at a sort of individual level how climate change will affect us. And to close out this section, I really want to drive home sort of the notion or the drivers of discrimination and bias in disaster response currently in the US. Some of my colleagues at Out for Sustainability put together a really, really great article on the three drivers that they find to be the most prominent around discrimination and bias in disaster response. And the first one is inequitable federal disaster response programs. So the biggest one would be the Robert T. Stafford Emergency Management and Disaster Assistance Act. It prohibits the discrimination in disaster programs, but this discrimination definition does not include sexual orientation or gender identity. Concurrently, we've seen during the Trump administration that in 2019, HUD had eliminated LGBTQ plus information from its anti-discrimination guidelines and websites. Also, Ben Carson, who was the ex-HUD secretary, had proposed amending the Equal Access Rule to exclude transgender people from discrimination policies in homeless shelters that receive federal support. So thinking a lot here about how at the federal level, there is a very inequitable response to disaster. And although Biden, I believe in 2021, had signed an executive order basically mandating that all federal agencies and programs make sure that they're not excluding LGBTQ people or other people on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity. But again, they're not exactly specifically put in our federal laws or also our federal disaster responses. Another driver that some of my colleagues have also mentioned in their report was that there's a lack of recognition of LGBTQ plus families during extreme weather events. And these events can sort of create LGBTQ home unmaking, or a lack of protections in disaster policy can result in the loss of homes and related trauma for queer people, both during and after disaster events. Thinking as well with heteronormativity in disaster response and recovery policies, we've seen through Hurricane Katrina and other events that LGBTQ plus couples had to pose as siblings to avoid separation. Here, just thinking about the sort of nuclear family model and how a lot of our disaster programs focus specifically on that sort of model. And a lot of queer people may not have they would have sort of a chosen family that might not be their sort of family by blood. And so this makes it increasingly difficult during extreme weather events because LGBTQ couples or same-sex couples might have to be separated during extreme weather events. And then also on top of that, there's also been findings of rampant transphobia and racism during extreme weather events as well. We saw during Hurricane Katrina that Leo Grisham and Shirley Vicks, both transgender women of color from New Orleans, were arrested for showering in the women's restroom in a shelter in Houston, Texas, after Hurricane Katrina. So again, thinking about how sort of everyday issues that affect the queer community are exacerbated during disasters. And third, another driver would be disaster relief and the intersection between faith-based organizations. And so faith-based organizations are increasingly providing food, shelter, transportation, and medical service during and after disasters. We see this a lot with the Salvation Army, and also in certain spaces, in particular, many rural spaces, faith-based organizations are sort of the first on the ground go-to organizations that are really helping communities during disasters when federal agencies like FEMA might not be able to get into those communities as quickly. But realizing that faith-based organizations can also alienate local queer populations who cannot access non-discriminatory relief services, and thinking about just the faith-based organizations more broadly in the US, there was I believe it was in 2008 or 2010, Jennifer Gale, who was a transgender woman, was refused entry to a Salvation Army-run homeless shelter in Texas and later died of hypothermia outside the shelter. And so thinking about that example really just drives home the notion that, LGBTQ people may be uncomfortable sort of going to faith-based organizations or receiving transportation, food, shelter from faith-based organizations during disasters. And so overall, these three drivers sort of move together and really drive home the notion that the experiences and social marginalization that LGBTQ people face in everyday spaces is exacerbated during disasters. Next slide, please. And so connecting all of this information to social work, just wanted to pinpoint how social workers are often first responders in disaster-related crises, and their clients often experience environmental justice issues, whether it's food deserts, lead poisoning, air pollution, and also extreme weather. Yet a recent study has shown that social workers may not be equipped with the information necessary to attend to issues like climate change that are not solely environmental, as I mentioned before, with disaster response, also with climate change in general, thinking about the different social, political, economic, and environmental contexts that sort of come together during climate change events. Thinking about that climate change is not solely a local issue, climate change is a global issue. And so thinking about how climate change may affect different people in different ways across geography. And then as well, thinking about how climate change will vary spatially and in context. So across states, sort of how social work might be influenced by what's going on in particular political climates, and how that influences our work on the ground. And so I thought this diagram that I put on the screen was really interesting, sort of thinking about the context within how social workers operate. And so thinking about how social work has to look at the differences between resources with power relations, thinking about the agency of themselves and their clients, thinking about the skills of themselves and their clients, and also just thinking about the social context and the physical environment, how social workers have to navigate resilience, risk, adaptation, and shock in their day-to-day working lives. And so sort of a question there is, how do we best support LGBTQIA plus clients during climate disasters? And so I wanted to end the presentation with just going over a few sort of equitable and inclusive policies that I and some of my colleagues think would be really great to sort of advocate for or implement in the future. And so the first one is advocating for expanded climate resilience planning. So this is around structural resilience, green spaces, and also progressive economic and housing practices and policies for all. Thinking about how queer people, as I mentioned, have high rates of homelessness, are often in low-income urban areas that might not have access to green spaces or have many impervious surfaces where flooding events might be more common or extreme. Just advocating for expanded planning and also pushing for progressive policies there would be extremely helpful. Next, thinking about advocating for inclusive climate action plans. So here, thinking about disaster preparedness, response, and recovery plans that are created in conjunction with LGBTQ plus communities, thinking about how queer experiences need to be enveloped within the plans that are put forth by FEMA and other organizations that work around disaster response. Third, advocating for accessible and non-discriminatory disaster relief that incorporates sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Fourth, advocating for the passage of the Equality Act, which includes sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics in the Civil Rights Act. And finally, advocating for further research on LGBTQ plus social marginalization, disaster displacement, and overall intersections with climate change impacts. And that concludes my presentation. Just wanted to again say thank you so much to the Boston University School of Social Work and also the Equity and Inclusion speaker series for hosting me.
Thank you so much, Brandon, for your enlightening talk, especially given everything that is happening in this present moment. And I'm excited to introduce our first reflector. Nayang Kim will be our student reflector. Nayang Kim is a clinical practice major in her last year at the BU School of Social Work. She's currently interning at the City School in Dorchester, where she provides clinical support and helps run the People's Response Outreach Campaign of Boston. She's passionate about intercommunity solidarity and anti-oppressive clinical practice.
Hi everyone, my name's Nayoung. I go by she, they pronouns, and thank you so much for being here, Brandon, and thank you to Sarah for asking me to reflect today. So some key points that I really appreciated was just really naming the fact that the key driver of climate change and all these extreme weather events is our behavior coupled with systems of oppression. I think that framing is really important. So I appreciated you highlighting that. And I also think you created a strong lens to help us look at these issues on how they specifically target and impact LGBTQ plus and queer people, among other marginalized groups. With that said, I have 3 questions for you, which I can repeat as needed. My first question is, how do we advocate for these policy changes in conjunction and in solidarity with Indigenous communities who've been defending the environment for eons? And how can we draw parallels to other struggles that are taking place globally and exacerbate and expedite the harm towards our planet, such as the fight against racial capitalism and colonialism, and the death and suffering of Palestinians against US bombing? And like I said, I'm happy to repeat the questions if needed.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I think tackling the first question, thinking about how to better include Indigenous communities as well. I'm thinking a lot, I guess, first my brain goes to geography, but thinking about sort of how, thinking about the history of the US, thinking a lot about how sort of this pristine myth of the environment or Native Americans or Indigenous communities were not sort of in the what we consider the US as it is today, thinking about nature as sort of something that we need to conquer, something that we need to go out and, remove resources from, extract from, things like that. And so thinking about how a lot of I guess thinking about how we really need to be mindful of sort of that extractive history and how it has, evolved into capitalism, evolved into wars, militarization that the US has, not only perpetuated against its own people, but also, across the world more globally. I guess that's a really good question. I'm not entirely sure what would be the best way to advocate in that way. I think it would just be really helpful to just make sure that yeah, LGBTQ people, Indigenous people sort of have a better seat at the table during discussions about climate, discussions about capitalism, and sort of thinking about all these interlocking issues, if that answered your question enough. Sorry. And then could you repeat your second question again?
Yeah, totally. How can we draw parallels to other struggles that are taking place globally and that exacerbate and expedite the harm towards our planet, such as the fight against racial capitalism and colonialism, and the death and suffering of Palestinians against US bombing?
Yeah, so I think maybe I'll talk a little bit about sort of what the nonprofit that I work through called Out for Sustainability, what we sort of focus on. And so for us, we are a queer-led and volunteer-run nonprofit that focuses on climate resilience and environmental justice for LGBTQ people, mostly in the US, but we have sort of shifted thinking about an international context as well. We have been sitting on committees with the UN, working around sort of sexual and gender minorities. And what we've been finding with sort of our work, not only our research and our advocacy, is that you can't really separate environmental issues, as you mentioned, from sort of these larger scale issues that are going on across the world right now. Particularly, we're seeing the continued bombing and destruction of both Lebanon and Gaza. We're seeing many other environmental crises, both in the US with hurricanes, but also in other geographies as well around the world. And I think it's just extremely, I guess it's really important to think about the complexities of these issues as you're moving through them or better understanding them. I think it's helpful that there are nonprofit organizations like Out for Sustainability that are sort of in this vein, that are trying to bring people to the table, queer people to the table around these sorts of issues, giving light to social and environmental issues as well. But we found that it's really sort of difficult to engage with these issues, particularly within a capitalist system, particularly being a nonprofit. You know, we have to have fundraising constantly. We have to be making sure that we have enough money to keep our website running and things like that, while also continuing, you know, to advocate on support of queer people and also other marginalized people around the world more broadly. And so, yeah, just thinking about like how complicated these sort of issues are, and how trying to understand how the environment is really embedded in all of these issues is something that I think really drives home the complexity of how, yeah, social marginalization is sort of in everything that is going on in the world right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nayang, and thank you, Brandon. Next, we have our alumni reflector, Jack Cohen. Jack Cohen, they is a clinical social worker with Massachusetts General Hospital's inpatient psychiatry and medical surgical services. As a BUSSW student, they completed internships at Ethos as a healthy IDEAS counselor and at Mass General Hospital in an intensive care unit and general medicine floors. Jack moved to Boston from Southern California with years of professional experience in outdoor leadership, special education, and mental health treatment. When they're not social working, they can be found unicycling, playing, listening to loud music, or enjoying the company of many cats, dogs, and humans they've come to know on the East Coast.
Yeah, thanks, Layla. And it's good to see a lot of those humans here in the Zoom room. Brandon, I think Nayang hit a lot of the points I was going to bring up. And one of the things that really just caught me about your presentation was how this is so similar to a lot of other forms of repression, where folks are like disadvantaged to begin with, and then a catastrophic event happens and they're more likely to experience the bad outcomes and then less likely to access support. So unfortunately, I found myself just kind of nodding along and feeling like I've heard this before with other communities, and really just saddened to hear that it's the same thing with the queer and LGBT community, of course, in different ways.
Definitely.
And I think that I don't want to sound like trying to put a positive spin on it, but I'm wondering, like, as a queer person, I feel like sometimes there's ways in which I have to move around the world, or ways in which people have to move around the world, in which we see possibilities that others might not see. And I'm wondering, like, what like in looking at these problems people are facing, if there's like a queer perspective that we can bring to the table, or like possibilities that you think we might see that other folks might not be as inclined to see.
Yeah, definitely. So I think you sort of hit the nail on the head as a sort of research gap that I'm hopefully going to try to fill with a bit of my dissertation work. So for my dissertation, which will probably be starting research over the next year or so, I'm going to be looking at how LGBTQ people are thinking about energy transition or energy futures in Appalachia. So particularly resource extractive areas in West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, and how I'm really interested because there isn't that much research sort of out there that's thinking about the queer sort of experience or queer lens on these issues. And so I'm hoping to find that, you know, I think from my master's research sort of that I touched on as well, that queer people are very sort of, they bring an awareness to these issues that I think a lot of definitely other marginalized groups can bring to the table as well. But thinking about sort of like the LGBTQ community overall as being sort of, a welcoming space for many people, a space where a lot of people are free to be themselves. Maybe they're able to have their own chosen families, things like that. And so the community as a sort of overarching lens tends to bind a lot of queer people together. And I think sort of also helps queer people think a lot about or think more progressively about some of these issues. So yeah, that I would say, I guess to sum up, is that hopefully with some future research and with my dissertation research, sort of just looking at the intersection between LGBTQ livelihoods and climate change, but also energy transition, sort of trying to understand if there is a way that we're thinking about these sort of issues that plague the US and globally, and also plague other socially marginalized groups. How can we better include that information into our decision-making and processes?
I have an additional question too. Working in healthcare, like to being here from a hospital room, does your research focus at all on climate change and how it's increasing the likelihood or impact of pandemics and disease outbreaks?
So my particular research is not, but one of the other people who is on the board of Out for Sustainability with me, I believe they're focusing more on public health around heat exposure and LGBTQ communities. So looking at sort of hospitalization rates around extreme heat or extreme weather or temperature events, and how that might be driving emergency room visits and things like that. So I would say my research more so is on like the, I guess you could say, mental health side, but other people are sort of creating more research around what you had mentioned.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you again, Brandon. And then I'm going to now introduce our faculty reflector, Maya Milic. She pronouns, is a social worker, community organizer, and faculty member at BUSSW. As a queer therapist, one of her clinical focuses has been working with queer and trans community. They practice with a liberation health lens, an approach which incorporates understanding of and challenges how systems and dominant worldview messaging uphold oppressive conditions, deeply impact mental health and well-being. So from this approach, Maya's work has ranged from working with queer and trans folks to challenge internalized and external forms of oppression, to organizing for a non-police, non-carceral mental health crisis response program for the city of Boston through the Boston People's Response Campaign.
Thank you, Leila, and thank you, Brandon, so much for being here and sort of sharing all this information. One thing I found myself thinking about as you were talking is about just sort of overlapping issues and how like oftentimes like certain issues and challenges can be portrayed in like this siloed sort of single issue way, when like really that's not the case. They're so like deeply interconnected. And Nayoung's reflections also sort of brought around a lot of that as well to sort of amplify that piece. And yeah, they're sort of connected to that, how like then, efforts to sort of challenge that need to be obviously so interconnected as well too. They can't just, organizing efforts can't just be focused in a siloed way either. And I think people might not necessarily think as much about like the intersections between climate justice and queer and trans folks. So I really appreciated like you highlighting that particular intersection. And as someone who's like worked with several like agencies that are focused on working with queer and trans people, it's not something I've heard that much about. So I just sort of appreciated learning about that particular intersection.
Yeah.
I also appreciated like you sort of sharing some like action steps at the end and like what to do, because I think, so much of it can't just be like learning. You have to actually put that learning into action.
For sure.
So in that vein, one just like small question I had was just curious if there are any orgs that are working specifically at that intersection of like climate justice and queer and trans liberation, to sort of highlight and uplift. And then also connected to that question, I was by chance this week reading about response to disasters, but particularly like mutual aid efforts that pop up, and how like those efforts often aren't covered in the media. Like the media just focuses on like how the state responds, how like nonprofits respond, even though like there's so much powerful mutual aid organizing that happens because the state and the orgs are failing. And so I'm just sort of curious in your research if you have any like, yeah, if you've come across any like powerful queer and trans folks organizing mutual aid in response to disasters to uplift too. But thank you for
Yeah,
being here.
definitely. So I would also say again, Out for Sustainability, we again are sort of a organization that is definitely focused on the intersection between LGBTQ livelihoods and environmental justice around climate change. I would also uplift another organization that's called Queers for Climate Justice. They work very closely with us. And also they two of the people who work for Queers for Climate Justice, their names are Vanessa Raditz and Natalia Villaron Quinones. They both have created two really, really important documentaries or docu-series that have come out recently that Out for Sustainability has helped support. One of them is Fire and Flood, that looks at how LGBTQ people experience climate change related issues. Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, I believe in 2017, and then California wildfires that happened, I believe, in the same year. And so documenting sort of queer experience around these disasters is one of the documentaries that they put together. And then also thinking about sort of the hurricanes that have recently happened. They have another docu-series that I believe is coming out soon that's called Can't Stop Change. And that specifically looks at queer and trans activists in Florida and their fight for sort of queer liberation and thinking about the intersection between climate change and environmental issues. And they also, through their work, the Eco Justice or the Queer Eco Justice Project, they focus a lot on mutual aid. And so Queers for Climate Justice on their Instagram, they have been posting a lot about different queer aid or mutual aid that's occurring around Hurricane Helene and Milton, specifically around the southeastern US and Puerto Rico. And yeah, I would just mention that we also at Out for Sustainability then try to reshare all of those different happenings and things like that. But as sort of a national organization, it's a bit, I guess, an interesting mix to be sort of thinking about scale, like where, have people that work with us quite closely are in these localized spaces. They're able to, uplift mutual aid that might be more localized than a national org might be able to do. And so we try to sort of also help facilitate, resharing, reposting, all these sort of things that need to be done during disaster response as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you again, Maya and Brandon. We are running pretty short on time, but we do have time for maybe one question from the chat. This is a question from Sirad Hassan. I guess it's two questions. In areas with high levels of a displacement, what strategies can social workers implement to provide immediate community-based support to LGBTQ plus and BIPOC refugees facing public health crises after climate disasters? Sirad also said, you mentioned that we should try to get a seat at the table, but I believe that approach language might be insufficient. Instead of seeking inclusion in systems built on racism and oppression, we should be focused on dismantling these systems entirely. Trying to fit into structures that have historically marginalized us only perpetuates the same inequities. How can we move beyond simply seeking representation and work toward fundamentally reshaping these systems to address the root causes of inequity and inequality?
Yeah, so I both really, really great points. I think I'll speak to the first question first. In the similar vein to what I was just speaking about with the Queers for Climate Justice and the Queer Eco Justice Project, they have, and Out for Sustainability is also sort of trying to improve this sort of document or resources that we bring forth, but essentially it's called the Q Ready Project. And it's a project where we're creating sort of a guide for LGBTQ people during disasters to be able to, pack a sort of backpack or like how to better prepare for environmental disasters and things like that. And I feel like that would be definitely super applicable to social workers who have to provide immediate community-based support to LGBTQ plus and BIPOC refugees during climate disasters. We're trying to sort of, I believe right now we have sort of a generic sheet that goes over sort of how LGBTQ people might need specific things during disasters, but we'd really like in the future to expand it to make it more sort of cultivated around if there's a fire or a wildfire, like this is, you know, a sheet where you can look at resources for how LGBTQ people might be affected, or specifically for tornadoes or hurricanes and things like that. So I would say that's definitely a guide that would be really helpful for social workers on the ground moving forward. And then also, I totally agree with the point that you brought up about sort of moving beyond having a seat at the table. I think it's really important to, how to best answer this question. I feel like it is a very important question that I feel like I don't have the answer to right now. I would say for us at Out for Sustainability, we're really trying to work at sort of an international level on these issues to think about how sexual and gender minorities aren't necessarily sort of at the table already, or like or even thought to be at the tables that we have currently, if that makes sense. And so I think we're sort of trying to get to that point, and then at the same time thinking about like liberation for marginalized people, trying to address root causes of inequality. I feel like in the disaster space, or sort of in the nonprofit space that I work in right now, we're sort of still not at that sort of resilience phase. We're still at the sort of, you know, we're here trying to respond to impacts as they occur and not thinking about sort of the long-term issues like climate change that are affecting us. And so I would say, yeah, with that, I unfortunately don't have the best answer for that question, but that is definitely something that our organization is thinking about on a day-to-day basis, and would love sort of suggestions on how to not only move our organization away from seats at the table and yeah, thinking about these issues more broadly.
Thank you so much, Brandon. And thank you. We want to thank everyone for coming. We want to thank our wonderful speaker, Brandon Rothrock, our insightful reflectors, Nayeon Kim, Jack Cohen, and Maya Milich. And finally, our amazing behind the scenes research assistants and the tech support for all of our E&I events, Marcus Shaw, Sarah Amkia, and Julia D'Angelo. I'll now be pasting, or Sada will be pasting the link to the CEU evaluation and quiz. Please note you'll need to access the link at this time. We're not really permitted to email this link to you at a later date, so please make sure that you can successfully access it now. We will keep the Zoom room open for another minute to ensure everyone has time to access the link. Please let Sada know if you have trouble accessing the link. Again, it'll take up to 2 weeks for you to receive your CEU certificate. In a couple minutes, we will remove any remaining participants from the Zoom room so that the event organizers can debrief. Also join us for the next speaker series event on Thursday, December 12th. This one will be from 5 p.m. to 6:15 p.m. So note the time that's changed. That's a little bit different than usual. The speaker will be Ian Ferguson, talking about his book, Marxism and Mental Health. And we're so looking forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you so much again for everybody who joined us today, and especially Brandon and our reflectors. And if our speaker reflectors and the EI team can please stay